Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and our program, Get to Know. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I'm here with my partner in crime, Kathleen Antrim.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be here. And I'm really thrilled to have one of my favorite authors on the show today. His name is Don Bentley. He's a New York Times bestselling author of his own Matt Drake series, of the Tom Clancy novels he's written, and now he's going to be writing Mitch Rapp, Vince Flynn's series. So we're so excited to have you, Don. Welcome to Get to Know.
Well, thank you so much for having me, guys.
This is going to be fun, and I have a big question for you to start with.
Oh, no.
I want to talk about your childhood.
Wow.
And how your childhood may have factored into your background and becoming a writer as well, because you've had a number of careers and you've done some really big things. And so I want to see, like, what kind of a kid were you? Were you introverted? Were you extroverted? Were you athletic? Did you have your nose in a book all the time? Tell us about your childhood.
Yeah, definitely a lot of no's in the book time. I grew up in the 80s, and so it was and I am the third member of my family, the third generation, rather, to serve in the armed forces. And so my father served in Vietnam, my grandfather served in World War II. And so at that time growing up, there really was a sense of good versus evil. There was a sense that there was, the Cold War was against an enemy that wanted to stamp out freedom, that was crushing people under its boot heel in all the Soviet republics and the Russian people themselves. And so, growing up in that time and having been imbued with this fierce sense of patriotism, I remember even as a kid in middle school writing stories that were not terribly great, but were kind of predecessor of the military thrillers that I would get to write later. And so I think, people ask all the time, do you have to be born with the ability to write, or kind of what makes you a writer? And I think what makes you a novelist, or a good novelist, is that you're born a storyteller. And so for the longest I can remember, even as a kid, I remember writing what we'd now call fan fiction, where you'd watch one of those amazing 80 TV shows like The A-Team or Knight Rider or Airwolf or something like that, and thinking, man, wouldn't it have been cool if they would have done this a little differently? And I actually would write, kind of my own ideas on how the show could have ended. And even as a teenager, when you're doing stuff like mowing the lawn, or I worked, my first real job was working fast food. And I remember being in the back flipping burgers and kind of telling stories to myself. And so storytelling was always a huge part of who I was, even as I was growing up. It just took me a while to be able to develop the tools that I needed in order to tell the stories that I wanted to tell in a way that would be commercially viable.
Well, I want to start off by thanking you and your family for your service. That's absolutely huge. And
yeah,
we as a country will never be able to thank you and our service members enough. And I want to tell our audience also that I know you were an Army Apache helicopter commander and a troop commander for the cavalry, the air cavalry.
Yeah.
So, and you've been deployed to Afghanistan and really have worked hard for us. So thank you so much. But I also want to ask, how did you decide? Were you always just going to go into the military, or was that just something that you were going to do because it was what kind of a family legacy?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's in a way, it was a family legacy. But in what I like to joke about is I'm the first one in my family who volunteered to serve. My grandfather and father were both drafted, and so did so involuntarily. And like I said, growing up, it just seemed like an extension of the pride I felt for my country. And so when I was in high school, about my junior year, I decided I was tired of school and didn't want to do it anymore, and didn't even know what I wanted to do. And an Army recruiter walked in that day, and I talked to him, and I think I scared the living daylights out of my dad, because I came home and I said, I'm going to be an airborne ranger. I met this guy at school. It was amazing. And to his credit, he said, if that's what you want to do when you're 18 years old, I'll drive you down to the recruiting station myself. but I'm not signing any delayed entry paperwork for you. You're too young to make that decision right now. Finish high school and we'll talk about it. And so as I was finishing high school, I heard about West Point and the Army ROTC, and actually applied to West Point and got my congressman at the time was Congressman John Boehner, and so I got
Oh, wow. Yeah.
a little blast from the past there. Um, got a congressional nomination to go to West Point, but my grades weren't nearly good enough to get in. And so I got an Army ROTC scholarship instead, and had an Army ROTC scholarship to the Army, but also knew that I wanted to fly. My dad had his pilot's license. He actually built a little kit plane, most of it in our garage before it got too big for the garage, and moved it out. And so I knew I wanted to fly, but I also knew that he had wanted to do the same thing in his senior year in college. His eyesight got too bad for him to be able to fly. And so I kept thinking, man, it'd be neat to fly planes in the Air Force, but if you can't fly planes, I don't know what in the world you'd do other than, wash the windows on those planes or something. And so I figured that in the Army, if my eyes went bad, they let you do stuff like drive a tank around and blow up things. And I figured that would be a good second choice if I couldn't fly. And so fortunately, my eyes held out, and I was high enough on the Order of Merit list to get aviation, and then again to get Apache. So it was a pretty fun gig.
That is so incredible. And
how
then you
old
went
were you,
on
and at what
also after.
stage in your career did you say, okay, I'm going to sit down and write a book? I got a story in my head and I'm going to write a novel. How did that happen, and where were you at that time?
Yes, I had some great teachers growing up who really, no matter what the assignment was, what the writing assignment, mine always ended up being some variation of a military thriller. And so sometimes that got me a stern talking to that said, this is not what you were supposed to do. But I also had some teachers who were very encouraging. And one of my junior high English teachers actually she's like, I've heard from it was in 7th grade or something. She's like, I heard from your 6th grade teacher, you like to write a lot. Why don't you give me what you have and I'll look at it and tell you what I think? And so she actually had taken this entire journal of stories and stuff that I had and kind of went through and critiqued it. And then I actually started writing my first book when I was in high school, and I didn't have any idea what I was doing. It was really bad, but I had another really great English teacher my senior year, and she pulled me aside after class one of the times where I don't remember what the assignment was, but my stories were always the same, regardless of what they were. And she said, this is really good. She said, I think that you could actually do this for a living. And so I kind of took that to heart and then went to The Ohio State University and majored in electrical engineering, as all good writers do. And so that first book, I got partway through and didn't really know what I was doing. And I started working on another book in college and got partway through and didn't know what I was doing. And so finally, about 2001 or so, I was in the Army at the time, and I thought, by God, I'm actually going to finish the book, because enough people knew, it's always easier to talk about being a writer than being an actual writer. And I told enough people, I was like, I actually have to finish this book. And so I worked on it and worked on it and worked on it. In the Army, you would had physical training, PT, that would start at 6:30 in the morning. And so I would get up about 4:30 and write for an hour or so before I went in. And I still had got to the point where I'm like, I don't know if I can finish this book. And so I did the worst mistake you can ever do as a writer, in that I started querying agents, because I thought, if somebody's interested in this, maybe it'll give me the motivation. And so he doesn't remember it, but the agent that's actually my agent now requested the full manuscript, and I didn't even have a full manuscript to give him. And so, being incredibly naive and stupid, I'm like, I'll finish it in a weekend. It'll be fine. And so I had worked all weekend, had this terrible book, sent it in, and he rightfully so rejected it. But it finally got the point to me that I could actually finish a book. And so it took me a long time and a lot of false starts. And that's why I think what you guys do, what we do as part of Outliers is so important, because I think there are a lot of storytellers who, like me, haven't finished developing all the tools in their toolkit. And it's so hard to figure out as a writer. If you listen to everybody, you're going to lose what makes you unique in your writing. And if you listen to nobody, you're never going to get any better as a writer. And so I think a lot of folks get involved in critique groups that end up kind of becoming self-licking ice cream cones, right? Because everybody's at the
That's a good
same
way to put it.
stage. You know,
Yeah.
they're trying their best to get feedback, but nobody has really succeeded in that group yet. And so how do you know if any of that feedback is valid or not? And that's what I think Outliers does so well, is that you bring in people who are successful, who have the experience to be able to say, hey, you're almost there, but here's that part that you're missing, that agents and editors just don't have the time to do for you when you're sitting in submissions or sending in query letters.
And you get a
Well,
topic that, whether
yeah.
if it's point of view or dialogue or whatever,
Yeah.
but you get multiple points of view. And I
Yeah.
think, as you well know, as a writer, you have to look at multiple points of view, because some of it's going to work for you and some of it's not.
Yep.
And we all remember when we started, you felt like you had to read all the books on writing and follow all the
Yep.
rules. No,
Yep.
no, 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 no. There are no rules. Just tell your story and get out of the way. It sounds like that's what you did. Are you an outliner, or are you just fly by the seat of your pants? I
I
mean,
wish I was an outliner. I wish I could be an outliner, but I'm just not. I think what I've gotten better at is I think so. A good friend of mine, who y'all know, who might be teaching with you too or not, I forgot, Nick Petrie, who writes The Drifter and a bunch of other good stuff. He told me that he thinks that your process as a writer changes a little with every book. You know, you learn something more about yourself and how to write, and so I've gotten a little bit better from the standpoint, like I love the book Save the Cat, the old version, the film version, and I still use note cards. I'm not a plotter, so I can't figure out those note cards and what needs to be ahead of time, but about every 20 or 30,000 words, I'll get stuck and I'll go back and reread it. And then I'll try and figure out where I am in the third act structure. And that helps me figure out what I should be steering towards. And so that's kind of mine, but I really don't know how the story's going to end until I finish it. Usually, by the time I'm in act 3, I have some kind of sense of it, or maybe I have an idea of what might be a really good climax. But for me, the magic definitely happens in those subsequent edits where you're taking something that's all over the place and then actually turning it into a coherent story. I mean, I reference Stephen James' book all the time, The Story
yeah.
Trumps Structure, because I
Yeah.
think he does a really good job of putting a something that's very messy, if you write organically, and saying, here's some steps to try and bring that process a little more under control. So that's a great book.
Yeah, Stephen's fantastic, and he also teaches for us.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for the kind words about Outliers. It's really a labor of love. It's a big passion to help
Yeah,
the
and
next
that's
generation
our
of
mission, is
writers.
to get the next generation going. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wish back 25 years ago I had something like this. I think Kathy and I met at the Maui Writers Conference, and that was when they did the Maui Writers Retreat. That was my first really introduction to someone teaching me how to write.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you go
Yep.
to conferences and you listen to panels and all this stuff, and it's little bits and pieces, but there's
Yep.
nothing coherent to it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And like
so
you,
much.
I'm a pantser too. I can't outline my first 6 books. I outline, but what I found is there's a difference between a plot and a story. And the
Mm-hmm.
plot's like the skeleton, but the story is all the flesh and bones. Well, we all
Yeah.
got the same
Yeah.
skeleton, basically. We just have
Yeah.
different flesh and stuff. So I found outlining confining. Like I was
Mm-hmm.
always trying to fight my way out of the boxes as I moved from scene to scene, rather than just let's don't worry about how it puts together.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how you approach it?
Yeah. I think the downside of that, because it sounds really great, right?
Yeah.
That you're going to tell yourself this story, is that you can waste a lot of words in subplots that don't go anywhere, and point of view characters that you don't really need. And so I think, as you Capture or Kill is my 9th book, and I've found that as I write more books, your instincts get better, and you start to, even though you're writing organically, you can kind of
Exactly.
sense when you're going off, or when you're for me, a lot of times most of my books have multiple points of view characters. And I started to realize that a lot of the words I was throwing away was subplots from a character that's not a protagonist. Because what I would do is get stuck and get to a really hard part of the book. And so rather than trying to figure out why I'm stuck, I'm like, I'll go write this other character. And you're really just hiding from your problem and then writing, because anybody can write, the first couple chapters of a point of view of a book or anything, because you don't have to pay off any of those promises, right? You can start completely fresh and paint on this canvas and not have to worry about how it ties together and everything else later. And so I think I agree with everything that you said, but I think people who write that way also underestimate the amount of time you spend revising, because so much of what you're learning as you continue the book, you have to then go back and address earlier chapters once you get done with that first draft.
And I think you're really plotting all along the way, because by the time you get to chapter 5 or 6, you kind of know what chapters through 10, 11, 12, and 13 are going to be, kind of. So you're really plotting in your head. It's just you're not making it formal and restrictive. That's kind of how I look at it.
Sure.
So when you start, do you just start with a concept? You just have an idea, a place? I mean, what's your nugget that you begin with?
Yeah, so for instance, for Capture or Kill, what I did is I went back and read all of so Capture or Kill takes place during the time when Vince was still writing the books. And so if you look at his books, he actually aged Mitch Rapp in real time up until and it escapes me right now, the book that comes before Capture or Kill. And then he went back in time and wrote 2 prequels. He wrote American Assassin and Kill Shot, came and then finished with The Last Man, which unfortunately was his last book before he passed away from cancer. And so when I was looking at his books, I noticed there was this gap in time that he hadn't addressed because he was writing the prequels. And for whatever reason, instead of writing The Last Man during that gap in time, he fast forwarded it to present day and just picked it up. And so I went back and made a bunch of notes of what were things that he left hanging, what were either plots that he didn't resolve, what were questions that he didn't answer. And then I started looking at that period of time and thought, what was interesting that happened here? And so it very quickly, I was like, the Osama bin Laden raid. And then it made me start thinking about, I wonder what Mitch Rapp was doing during. In fact, I remember sitting, I was an FBI agent at the time, and standing in my living room in Dallas and watching as President Obama came up to the lectern and said, we just killed bin Laden. And, my first thought was, it's about time we, got rid of that SOB. And then the second part was, for me, I think Vince and Afghanistan were linked together in some way, because I read a lot, in Afghanistan, there's a lot of downtime, and everywhere you go, there are these little makeshift lending libraries. You'd go to the gym and people would have just stacks of paperbacks that they'd read and put there. And so I read a lot of Vince Flynn books while I was in Afghanistan. And so I remember thinking that, and then thinking kind of in a joking way, I wonder what Mitch Rapp would have done during this. And so fast forward to the opportunity where I had to write a book, I started researching. I was like, I wonder if Vince ever addressed it. And so sure enough, it was one of the questions on his website. I think it's still there. They have questions that readers would write into him about the series, about the characters, and that was one of them. And he answered it in a way that was ambiguous enough to say he thought about it, certainly, but he hadn't ever fleshed that out. And I thought, that would be a really fun thing to do, because as a writer, what you're trying to do when you take over a legacy series is to capture the spirit of what that writer did, but you obviously have to bring your own take to it. And I thought, rather than having Vince writing and then Kyle, who did a fantastic job, Kyle Mills, I say all the time, like, Kyle could have just tread water. He could have just tried to keep the series afloat, and he took it in incredible directions. But I thought, man, if I'm going to have credibility with the fans and everything, wouldn't it be neat to go back to Vince's time and use that as kind of training wheels, right? Because anything I did with this book, I knew there were books before it and books afterward. And so it had to be worthy of standing on its own without upsetting the apple cart and radically changing the series. And so once I had that, then I started researching. It was funny. I had to pitch the idea to Emily Bessler, who was Vince's editor and Kyle's editor and is my editor too, and to Sloan Harris, who was Vince's agent and who still represents the family. And so Emily was, I was doing it over Zoom, and she was pacing back and forth in her kitchen and in my head. And I'd never met her in person. In head, I'm like, she hates this. Like, she's getting ready to tell me we made a mistake, not just with the book, but with you. And so she got done and looked into the camera and she's like, I love it, write it. And I'm like, okay, that's good. But Sloan was a little bit harder sell. And at one point, he's like, so are you telling me that Mitch was number 2 behind Rob O'Neill in the tactical stack? Like, is that what's going to happen? And I'm like, no. That's not what's going to happen. But in my head, I didn't know what was going to happen. I just had this idea. And so I had to do a lot of research and then found some really interesting things about how the CIA set the conditions for that raid and some things that happened at the time. And so some parts of the book actually feature things that happened or things that could have happened or things that were loosely based on what happening. And so all of that kind of gave me the big idea for the book, but it's still, I think Stephen King is the one that used this analogy, but for me, it's still very much like it's an archaeological dig and you're slowly, dusting off pieces of that skeleton and seeing a little part of the bone here and something there and something you don't even intend here ends up connecting to something over here and making the whole book better. So it was by far the most challenging thing that I've ever done from a writing perspective, but certainly the most rewarding too.
I mean, it sounds like a lot of pressure, obviously. And clearly you have done an amazing job of thinking this through from all different angles. And I love that analogy with archaeology. Yeah. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the book and how our readers can buy it?
Yeah, so you
our
can
readers,
get
our listeners.
readers, listeners, watchers, any of those people. Love them all. So you can get the book anywhere books are sold. You can also, my website is donbentley.books.com and it's linked there as well. And so feel free to check that out. But so when the book starts, Mitch Rapp is actually in Pakistan and he is there to kill a Pakistani businessman who's been financing terror stuff, because that's what Mitch Rapp does, is he's uniquely gifted to be able to hunt bad guys on their home turf. And while he's waiting for his target to come into this coffee shop, an Iranian general sits down across the table from him, addresses Mitch by one of his cover names, one of his legend names, and says, there is an attack that's about to go down in Afghanistan. You're going to see it all over Fox News in about 5 minutes. You might want to do something about that, and then walks away. And so that's what kind of launches the book off. And so as this Iranian plot is metastasizing in Afghanistan, it picks up in real time. Like I said, the dates are actually true. It's the weekend before the bin Laden raid, and the president has cold feet because they still haven't been able to verify who is in that compound and whether it's bin Laden or not. And there's only one guy he trusts to tell him the truth. And he happens to be rather busy at the time. So it was really fun to do.
Oh my gosh, I cannot wait to read this. So the release date is September 3rd, correct?
Yes.
But I'm going to, encourage our listeners to please get out there, order the book now, and make sure that you're, first in line so you get it right away. And I know I will be, that's for sure. And Don, it's been great to have you. I mean, you are fantastic. Don will also be teaching an Outliers class in our year-long core curriculum in October. And you might want to check us out at outlierswritinguniversity.com. You can learn more about his class and other classes we have going on. And this is a class you're not going to want to miss. If you even think you have any inkling that you might want to be a writer, you want to definitely join this class. Doug, do you have anything else?
No, thanks so much, Don. We really appreciate you being here. We also appreciate you being an outlier. That's important to us, and appreciate you passing on your knowledge to other people. And I think based on this interview, people who see this are going to say, yeah, I want to learn something from that guy. He knows what he's talking about. And I agree 100%. So we're looking forward to your class in October. And I hope the book does very, very well. I'm sure it will. And so this has been Get to Know here on the Outliers YouTube channel. As you know, we will be back with other shows very soon. And until then, we'll see you next time.